a 14-year-old.
My niece has the same hairstyle she had when she turned 14. That was her, for sure. And that was him, definitely.
Various sexual acts, including urination, oral sex.
For him to do that to her.
I took it, and he never noticed it was gone.
I just didn't know that it was a point in time where they were talking about killing me.
I should have never introduced her to him. I should have never introduced my family to him. How dare you? How dare you?
I introduced my niece to Robert, and I saw her in the studio by herself. And I would walk in like, what you doing here?
Him and I both were actually having sex with her. I was unaware at that time of how young she was. She was actually 14.
It is a 6-part series that I felt as though the world stopped. These are not new allegations, but what we've seen is that Sony has decided to distance themselves from the singer. We've also seen that an investigation has been reopened, but the stories of abuse, culture, privilege, and the music industry now again dominating the discussion. It seems like a very divisive topic. Many see it as a hypocritical position. They say it's not a new position, and also they see this as simply going after a successful black entertainer in the US. Let's face it, rock and roll and other genres of pop music, the allegations dominate. But in the end, is it simply that today in 2019, the world is not going to accept the double standards? And will this be the beginning of a conversation of what we see as inappropriate privilege, culture, and also rape, abuse, and everything else? Well, joining us to have this discussion, we have Tennille Clark, Amilcar Salalson, and David Mohammed, all having experience not only with the music industry, but also our stereotypes, our culture, our understanding. And it's interesting to get their ideas as to what's taking place. Good morning, how are you all?
Good morning, thanks for having us.
Now, Tennille, let me start with you as the lone female on the panel this morning. This is a 6-part series, and I know there was a lot of hype around it.
Yes.
Lifetime did indicate that they were going to have this. To many, it was not a new discussion, but I guess the way it was packaged. When you sat and you looked at it, what was your first reaction?
I mean, to see that reality being documented in such a lifelike way, everything from the production, there were over 50 interviews done with 50 different women. I'm sure some of them did not make the cut. This is an industry where anything goes. And for R. Kelly, I think that the way that he was able to guise his vice was through a branding of rebelliousness. So for me, when I analyze his branding portfolio, I see a duality. I see inspirational art, and I see outrageous art. And it's that hiding in plain sight that has been able to propel him over 30 years of these kinds of nefarious activities.
Amilcar, when you looked at the documentary and you looked at, these are not new allegations. The story with Leo, but we all knew it. But everyone sort of just put a blind eye to it, because his music was so inspirational. Yes. I believe I can fly. A lot of people could still say, you know, it's okay. What did you think when you saw it?
One of the first things I think the show or the docu-series really establishes what toxic masculinity can look like. That a person could express positive messages about community, family, self-efficacy, motivation, believing they could fly, right? And playing basketball with Bugs Bunny. But at the same time, that same person could be a person who has abused persons for a very long period. In the 2000s, we had a child pornography trial with R. Kelly. And in fact, Aaron Magruder, the director of Boondocks, has a famous episode about the trial of R. Kelly and using it around racial stereotypes, gender stereotypes, and showing you how the community absolved him. Now, the case of R. Kelly does one thing in particular, which is show you the value of a victim-centered approach and how long it takes to do that qualitative work to bring forward those voices. And this goes hand in hand with the recent report Dr. Gabriel Hosang published on violence against women in Trinidad and Tobago. But the second point, it shows you that in a system like African Americans feel in the United States, when persons, African American, men in particular, are seen as guilty and their lack of confidence in that legal system, they sometimes say that the system against them and ignore the actual victims of that same African American man.
David, R. Kelly's story is one of people look at him as a success story. He came out of very humble beginnings, out of the projects in Chicago. You know what the poverty was like. And he is hailed as making it as a superhero. He is what young Afro-American children strive to be, getting out of the projects. What did you think of the documentary?
Right. Well, without commenting directly on the documentary, because all that has been featured regarding his conduct, we absolutely condemn, distance ourselves from, reject, and lift our voices in total rejection of that being acceptable. However, I think that in trying to understand this, there are major puzzle parts that are missing. And the fact is, this is a byproduct of white culture and a white entertainment industry. And I make the point, going back to probably the genesis of global popular music. Elvis Presley had a fetish for 14-year-old girls, which was punctuated throughout his catalog. The Beatles, probably the most famous pop group ever, in 1963 sang I Saw Her Standing There, which was a mega hit, which began with She Was Just 17, if you know what I mean, and then the song goes on to speak of a romantic relationship. The Rolling Stones, who were probably second only to the Beatles, sang Stray Cat Blues, where Mick Jagger spoke of a relationship with a 13-year-old. And interestingly, the bass player for the Rolling Stones, Bill Wyman, in 1983, at age 47, had an open relationship with a 13-year-old. And then you have people like Neil Diamond, who's so sanitized, who sang Girl, Soon You Will Be a Woman. And even Ted Nugent, who's a huge Donald Trump supporter today. You know, one sec, these songs are called jailbait songs. It's a whole genre in white culture.
What do you want to say to R. Kelly if he's watching?
R. Kelly, you have 3 children, 2 of them being girls. Do you even love your children enough to think that it's okay to treat me and all the other victims that you've treated? How would you feel if someone would have treated any one of your 3 kids, even all 3? You would be upset. I'm sure you would probably want justice served. So why won't you just look at, if these are your kids, let them go. Let everybody live normal lives.
I don't have anything to say to him. I don't even know if I want an apology. I wouldn't even feel it was real. I just think he's numb to people's feelings, and he knows about my story. He's been dismissive about it. He still didn't address what he did to me. So I just hope he gets help. He admits to his wrongdoings, and he's held accountable.
We are continuing a discussion on this. Steely, let's take it away from the R. Kelly. This is an industry problem. Yes. It's an entertainment problem. So let's talk about the industry. Is this the norm? Do we see the sexualization of girls of this age difference? Is it simply age is just a number?
I think that with the sexualization of girls, to have that conversation, you need to speak about the larger conversation on the inconvenience of popular music. Nobody wants to... Divorces are hard, regardless of what circumstances or situations you look at. And nobody wants to use the idea of divorcing this great entertainer of great notoriety from this sexual predator. So that inconvenience in popular music, when you look at the Beatles and you look at Rolling Stone and you look at other key figures, key male figures throughout history, there's a clear pattern there where people have been hesitant to separate the entertainer from the person. And that's where R. Kelly has been able to maintain and to feed his predatory behavior for over 3 decades.
So no one sees it as wrong?
No one sees it as something that they want interfering with their entertainment experience. I think that's the best way to describe it.
David, you know, I saw the discussion that, and you raised the point about the dichotomy between the black community, the white community, the Caucasians, and the African Americans. Is it, so let me ask, because this is one of the questions I was put forward by a viewer, why did black America tolerate his behavior for so long?
Right, that is the part that is wrong. That is totally wrong, because I don't know anyone who tolerated this behavior. I'm in Chicago pretty often, and I'm very connected and grounded with the black community in Chicago. I've never met anyone, and I mean, I attend numerous forums and seminars and workshops in Chicago, and I've never met anyone who has tolerated or enabled that, but I've heard numerous voices being lifted against it. But just to conclude the point about it being white culture, you had Billy Idol singing Sweet 16, you had Kiss singing Christine 16, with Gene Simmons doing this deep voice narrative about looking at a 16-year-old girl coming out of school. You had Police who sang Don't Stand So Close to Me, which also is about a teacher with a school child. But Benny Mardones, who had a huge hit, one of the few songs that was in the top 20, left, and 9 years later came back in the top 20, Into the Night.
Oh, I love, and I do love that song. Everyone knows the song,
right?
yeah.
If I could fly, I'd lift you up into the night, and so on. The first words in that song are, she's just 16 years old. Now, Benny Mardones is a grown man singing to this song, and if you see the video for that, it's about the video is him knocking on the door of this 16-year-old girl, the father coming out, you know, basically saying, hell no. Then he goes around the side, climbs up through the window with like a mattress folded up, lays it out on the ground in the bedroom of this 16-year-old girl. So we're talking about R. Kelly on the backdrop of a culture in white entertainment where a blind eye has been turned to this. Even going back, we spoke about the 1960s, but on shows like the Ted Mack Show and Ed Sullivan and all these, this was promoted and accepted. And there's an even further
So do you see this as simply a
stands.
backlash against R. Kelly? Is this are we using him as a poster child to say, okay, let's just make one victim, or let's just do one lynching and we'll be okay? That we will say it's all right and then leave everyone else, because you had the Harvey Weinstein situation,
right?
Where that has also
right. So looking at the root of it, because we spoke about the music of the 60s and the 70s and so on, but it goes beyond and before that. The foundation of this is in the objectification of individuals through a sense of entitlement on one side and ownership of someone on the other side. You have, during slavery, diaries that were kept. One example is Thomas Thistlewood in Jamaica. He was a slave owner in Jamaica in the mid-1700s. He kept a diary of sexual perversions, some of which you see in the R. Kelly documentary about the whole urination, excretion, group sex, rape. And this is why Jamaica is one of the most homophobic societies today, because they had a process called buck breaking, where they would sodomize men in order to demean their leadership qualities on slave plantations to quell resistance and rebellion. And they would put a paper bag over a man's head and cause him to have conjugal relations with his own relatives. It's an entire decrepit system of dehumanization. Now, the most universal factor in this kind of abuse is that the perpetrator is most times a victim. As we discussed, R. Kelly himself was a victim of abuse, but it's a pattern and a cycle. And if it's ignored in some circles and dimensions, it would go on and on. So
do you think America's
others.
Reaction to this is hypocritical?
Well, of course it's hypocritical, but it's not even voluntarily hypocritical. It is almost like an unsuspecting being lured into a conversation. I heard one person, Tariq Nasheed, describe this as, and I'm not fully condoning his description of it, but I understand. He described it as fake outrage, meaning that it is almost orchestrated or choreographed outrage, that you're seeing responses from people simply because there are responses from other people. And because of that now, it's like we've been awoken into realizing something wrong taking place when it's been taking place all the time before our eyes, but because there was no public reaction, our own feelings about it were suppressed.
And let me bring you into this conversation. We know that this is wrong. You know, you look at the remorse, the Aaliyah situation is not new. I remember, I was an R. Kelly fan when Aaliyah was the biggest thing on the planet, and we all knew that there were rumors about her being 15 and 16 at the time, and then this marriage occurred with this number at 18, that she was 18 years old. Why do women simply ignore these signs? Is it, and all of these women, the 14-year-olds, the 15-year-olds, the 16-year-olds, who all see him at the mall and then would go to the studio and be part of this?
Yeah, so the first thing I have to establish, I have a contrary view to the ones on this panel here, is that this was a problem with James Brown, it was a problem with Miles Davis. And black women have consistently protested R. Kelly. Does the issue have much more visibility than it had in the past? Yes, but women have always challenged this, and we have to be careful of how we ignore black women's protests of even black male individuals in the community and just give them the cop-out of false equivalences, wipe hypocritical systems, and so on. Just go in there to answer the question. What we see, the reason why Harvey Weinstein didn't get the same attack as Louis C.K. or R. Kelly is because he wasn't a frontline celebrity. Being behind the scenes, there's a different type of public scrutiny you will get than Federer and Serena as compared to the head of the NBA or the Tennis Association, right? And that is important for us to appreciate. So that's one. So LeBron James will not get treated the same as the head of the NBA. But the second issue is that these persons occupy positions of power, and we saw that with the Bill Cosby case as well. They are the gatekeepers for access. Bill Cosby wasn't just a predator. He was someone who operated almost as a de facto agent, therefore having a good relationship with him meant you were on his show. The same way with R. Kelly. R. Kelly was in the studio with Aaliyah. He married her at 15. His manager said that they got married and she was just 15 and was complicit in it, and they challenged, the parents challenged him, and they stopped the relationship, but he gave her a recording contract under his label. So these persons are not just some random predator in a dark alley living somewhere. They are gatekeepers to access for your success in the industry. Unfortunately, this has become normal and understood, and until we read letters like Lupita's challenging Harvey Weinstein, until we see accountability like Louis C.K., who get a serious burnout in the industry, but he owned up to his issues. R. Kelly never owned up to any of it. He continued trying to be successful, and now black women are saying no to this, and there's no doubt white racism is fueling some of the pressure against him, which is unjustified or false outrage. But at the same time, we must maintain our line and say we are here to defend the victims, like all those women we see on the documentary.
And I also want to add as well to Amil's point, because he makes a very salient point about black women and being believed.
Right.
Exactly.
That is something that even I face every day as a publicist. Because for me, the act of powerlessness is a superpower. It's a superpower, especially when you are inherent and intent on protecting your interests, even if that means removing autonomy from other persons, especially black women, and especially if it is that you are intent on removing humanity from other spaces as well.
You're in the industry, so I mean, I made it in the introductory statement that this is not an unusual situation, and we've heard it from time immemorial, these artists and these young girls. But when you look at the staff themselves and you look at everyone else, you talk, is it simply that people are afraid to challenge these figures? And you look at the young girls who are hoping to get a recording contract, who see these men and women as a lifeline.
Well, first of all, I would like to categorically state that I don't think that we have properly documented enough experiences within the industry. A lot of people would know about situations and circumstances, but we generally in the Caribbean, I find that we have issues with documenting these kinds of issues of abuse. As it relates to the industry and understanding the power dynamics, I think it's important that we look at the bigger picture. If you have persons in a position of authority that are able to grant you access to different spaces to elevate your own career, it's hard to navigate those spaces when you know that these people almost they almost thrive off of predatory behavior, so the access becomes difficult. So then the solution does not it doesn't center around R. Kelly or that one person. We now have to decentralize the conversation, and we have to understand that every single person around R. Kelly was a victim, whether it was emotional abuse, whether it was financial abuse, whether it was sexual abuse. They all had something to lose, and they all ran a risk of not being able to access spaces that they rightfully should have had access to.
I just want to add to Bill and Tennille's point. All three of us here use public platforms.
Yeah.
So David Mohammed is on radio. People will fall in love with that voice and his intellectualism.
Thank you.
Tennille uses social media. People will like the way that she is promoting herself. Brandon, yo, that is a woman who knows what she's about. The same way in teaching, there's an erotic component. The same way you had a crush on your maths teacher in Form 3, at the university level, you would be impressed by a sociologist who's critiquing class conflict, right?
Right.
What we therefore have is that not to ignore the erotic dimension of persons in authority and young persons or people who are not of age to consent, but to create accountability mechanisms to challenge it. And we have examples of groups such as the Two Cents movement has an artist constitution to deal with accountability for artists because they do school tours and they work with young people. Of course, if you come to a secondary school and young people in school uniform seeing adult fellas with locks and this girl with a tattoo and nose ring, they'll get excited by it, try to send you a message on Facebook. But there's an accountability for persons with power, and I think that is where the conversation should go. So we don't just have social media justice, but start to think about justice in very practical outputs.
I pray that you see this, you feel this, and you get the help needed, because this can't keep going on. You can't keep doing this, dude.
What would you say to him?
I'd just like you to know that you really hurt me. I was a little girl in like a bad man's world. I never really recovered from it. I'm really angry with you for what you're doing. I don't understand it. Why you would want to hurt so many women. I just really hope that you let the women go home and get the support and help that they need. And you take some responsibility for what you've been doing for over 25 years. I mean, enough is enough.
Dave, before I bring you into the conversation, Tila, I want to ask, you know, in that docu-series, now we see a lot of artists and big names attaching themselves to the wave that is now started. But when the documentary was being filmed and they approached members of the entertainment industry to take a stand on sexual abuse, on violence, on the degradation of women, John Legend was the only one that stood up and said, I'm going to attach myself to this and I'm going to make a stand and say that it's wrong, that I believe these women with no strings attached on it. Now everyone is talking about it, the double standards in the industry.
I think to have that conversation about double standards, we also have to look at unequal power dynamics, and it kind of works both ways, right? So it's not only about the unequal power dynamics surrounding sexual abuse, but then you have unequal power dynamics as it relates to success in the industry. And when you build more restrictive tendencies for artists to work in, where you know that there are consequences to speaking out, you now are left with a choice. Do you now limit your access to pursue your dreams, as Lizette would have experienced at a very young age? Or do you stay silent and seemingly complicit in the conversation? Because Jay-Z rejected doing an interview. Quite a few other persons.
Even Lady Gaga, who now decided to get involved.
Well, they dragged her eventually on Twitter. And it's about using your access and your power to have the difficult conversations, and I think that's where people were able to stand in unison. They realized that there was a powerlessness that was surrounding these women regardless of the kinds of powerlessness that was happening on the ground in the industry, and they rallied in order to start or to continue the conversation, because I don't like the idea of it being a starting point. It's a continuum, and we need to continue remembering that this is a conversation that is happening consistently, and we need to consistently hold people accountable.
You talk about the accountability aspect of it, David, but even when the allegations started, he had the situation with Aaliyah, a number of other women who are part of the African-American community, women in particular. But even when the scandals dogged him, he performed at the Olympics. His stardom was not affected.
Well, I mean, under normal circumstances in these kinds of situations, there is no restriction of the access of the star power of the individual. Yes. But I think that is probably the key term here, power, and each of us have addressed it, and the fact that there are power differentials. Men have historically taken advantage of domination over women, but of course that paradigm is changing now because of women becoming empowered. And so more attention is being paid in areas where it should have been paid for the last 100+ years since World War I. But as it stands now, we run the risk of this kind of behavior being somewhat sanctioned as socially acceptable if we don't take the kind of steps to properly address it. And when someone is abused, a human being has value. And when someone is sexually abused, they feel devalued. And one of the only coping mechanisms psychologically to deal with that is to devalue the sex act itself and remove any sacredness from it so that I can reacquire the value that I feel that I lost. So you find most times women, for example, who turn to prostitution, it is shown that they would have been at some point in their life molested or raped or sexually abused. And one of the coping mechanisms is to, again, just remove any kind of sacredness from sexual activity. And there are all different types of challenges of women trying to rescue themselves psychologically. Unfortunately, in cases like this, there was universal silence, but now we're speaking out. We had 2 cases last year in 2018 of teenage girls who were picked up by taxi drivers who were drugged and impregnated mysteriously. Both cases were dealt with at the Movar police station. And what was universal about those and similar cases was that there was a fear of speaking out. There's this perception that the society will not be sympathetic towards this kind of plight because it's become so common, it's become so socially acceptable and ordinary. And with the large amount of cases that there is more and more fear and trepidation about speaking out against it. So I think this conversation has great merit, and conversations like this can contribute towards that courage that is required from all of us to condemn this kind of behavior.
And even to build on that, it's funny because in the documentary, they mentioned, a couple of the psychologists mentioned the act of learned helplessness. And I think it's very, very important to make note of that, because what you find happening is that the pattern that R. Kelly used is essentially asking who is willing to cross that first line. So you find that the vulnerability with that conversation allowed him to build bridges that should not have been allowed. So learned helplessness is something that we definitely need to take note of, because that's a universal trait that abusers use as well.
Okay, what's our takeaway from this, and how can we use this to shift our conversation locally?
I would just think that the example of John Legend is very important. That is something we could take away, where he has expanded this idea of call-out culture to show there's a civility he could maintain and at the same time stand on justice. He did it for Kanye West with his opposite views on how he was celebrating Donald Trump's and especially racist policies. He has done it with R. Kelly by speaking out, but also trying to use his platform to raise awareness on the justice issue. I think we could take that way and understand that rape culture is very much alive in our professional spheres of work, but even our personal ones. I love the example you brought up because it is tragic, and while growing up not we, meaning I participated in it, but I saw with boys and Spanish fly, and these other things, drugging girls and so on, was normal. What was written off as a joke, what we thought was every day. And I hope that we could break the status quo.
Taylor, take away from this.
I think I sit here and I'm listening to Amil speak, and I remember last year sometime, the president of the West Indies Cricket Board, David Cameron, he said that he was diametrically opposed to female cricket teachers because boys learn from men. And I used that as the basis of my conversation for my presentation at the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women last year. And if it is that we are to change the dynamic of how we dialogue about these experiences, the UN has this specific policy in place called the He for She campaign. Winston Duke actually was the keynote speaker late last year about that conversation. Men need to hold other men accountable. That's going to be a huge part of the thrust of accountability that needs to happen, not only in the entertainment industry, but sporting industry across all industries and borders.
David, our takeaway.
And coming off from that, I would say that we as a Trinidad and Tobago society have to question the degree of moral authority that we possess to be able to condemn these kinds of episodes, because in our own culture, there is way too much incorporation of disrespect and degradation of women in general, and the promotion and over-sensationalization of loose promiscuity. And I think that we have to look internally as well and question that among ourselves, in contrast to what we're seeing happening overseas here.
I'm sure this is not going to be the end of this type of conversation, but hopefully we can learn from the example in the US to make sure that we not just move forward, but we continue to protect our women and believe them. And that's the one takeaway that I had, that women still face a battle of belief. So let's try giving them the benefit of the doubt. We take a short break. When we come back, we'll have more for you. Stay with us.
What would you tell Robert if he's watching this?
Why? 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 It's like watching a family member damage themselves and you can't help them, you know? Because in hindsight, we all were a family. And my question would be why? And I think in hindsight, if he had told somebody early on what had happened to him, just maybe he wouldn't have turned into the person that he is. I would tell him to get some help. I would tell him that this was not done to hurt you. This was not done to slander you. This was done to help you. You need to see the effects of your behavior. You need to see how you have ruined lives, how you have damaged relationships, how you have torn up other people's families.